Does that say recording? Yep, I think it's recording now. I hope so. I hope it's right. If not, we'll get there. All right, we'll continue on. We're going to look at 2 Samuel, which is basically the continuation of David's life. Saul is off the picture. He has been killed in battle. His sons are killed, and they take and make David king, and he reigns in Hebron for 7 years, 6.5 years, almost 7 years. And 2 Samuel is, just in summary, is about where, and we'll look at it more in a moment, but where we see the most of David's life as being king. We see his mistakes, we see his reaction, we see all the different things about David's life. And the one thing I like about David is he's always described as a man after God's own heart. And in saying that he's a man after God's own heart, you get to realize that even though he made his mistake, there was something about David's heart towards the things of God that reflected to God. So God didn't look on the appearance, but on the hearts of men and women. He knows you. If we want to understand it, He knows you. You can pretend, and it's like this. You can fool me. You can fool your pastor. You can fool all those round about you. I think I turned it on. Jim checking his worksheet out of the head of Jim. I got it. He knows you. He knows all about you. And you can fool those round about you. You can pretend to be a Christian, but God knows your heart. That's what it is like. So in 2 Samuel, we see that David receives a report of Saul's death and Jonathan's death, and he immediately begins to weep. But, you know, some people like to do what happens next. Because this man that comes to David, and David asks him who he is, and he says, I'm an Amalekite. And he said, I was in the battle, and he says to him, he says, how do you know Saul was killed? Now that's, I'm paraphrasing it. Okay? That's not how the scripture reads. He said, how do you know Saul's dead? And the man speaks up, he said, because I'm the one that did it. And basically that's what he says to him. He said, I'm the one that did it. I'm the one that killed him. And we know that's not true. Saul committed suicide. His armor bearer committed suicide. His sons were killed in the battle. But Saul and his armor bearer committed suicide. And David takes and reigns upon him and says, you know, buddy, your own voice has condemned you. And you see, a man, he brought me news, and he thought I was going to give him a reward. And he said, I didn't give him a reward, I killed him because of his own words. And so the same thing's going to happen to you. And that's even in life today. A lot of people think that, you know, if I can destroy this one, or if I can make it look like I killed this one or destroyed this one, then it'll make it better for me, and I can, as we would say, climb the ladder. Whether it's in the corporate world or in the spiritual world. You know, if I can just get the youth leader out of the way, then maybe I can take over his position and so forth. And all. God knows your heart. And God judges your heart. And God will reveal. And this man lost it because David said, you don't kill God's anointed. God takes him out of the picture, not you. That's why he never laid a hand on Saul, and all the time he was being chased. Because he would not touch God's anointed. That says a lot about today too. So David is anointed in Hebron, and then Abner comes to him and takes and says, look, I'll bring the kingdom to you. The son of Saul that's on the throne, he makes an insult to Abner as the general of the army, torments Abner and says, you know what, you were sleeping with my dad's wife, is what he said. And he rebels against him, and he goes to David, and he makes an agreement with David to bring the rest of Israel into and under David's authority. We know that Abner does this, and he leaves. He makes a league with David, and Joab comes home and finds out Abner's been there, and he says, you know, you let him go free. What? He killed my brother. And that's what had happened. Joab's brother was killed by Abner. Not in battle, but because Abner didn't have a weapon of any kind when he was murdered. And so Joab tricks Abner into coming back, and when he does, he slays him. And the thing is that we see David doesn't deal with Joab right away. Matter of fact, Joab stays in charge of the armies of Israel. And they take David and they anoint him as king the second time. But they anoint him as king in Hebron. He's there for 7.5 years. And then he's also brought to Judah by Abner and anointed king there. And he was king over all of Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 40 years, so he was 70 years old when he died. David's political triumphs, let's put it this way. He reigned as king over Judah in Hebron for 7.5 years, and he was reigned king over a united nation of Israel, reigned for 30 years. And he brought the capital of the United Nation to Jerusalem. And David set up his throne in Jerusalem. Now, David also had some spiritual triumph in his life. The first and one he is known for, the majority everybody knows, is David brought the Ark of the Covenant back to the children of Israel, into Jerusalem. And he made a tent to house the Ark of the Covenant. But David is not allowed to build a temple, because we know that David talks to Nathan and says, you know what, I really want to build a temple. And he says, I'm going to do it. And Nathan looks at him. He's the prophet of God. He says, do what's in your heart, sir. You got the right. You're going to go to it. But as Nathan's leaving, God speaks to him and says, no, sir, you go back and tell him he's not building it. Can you imagine the disappointment in David's life? If that was us, we'd be fit to be tied, as I would say in Canada. We'd be so upset, there'd be no consoling us. But David doesn't do that. You notice when you read the scripture, you'll find out that David goes in before the Lord and he worships God. Because, you know, David can't build the temple himself, but the prophet has come in and told him that his sons are going to sit on the throne. In other words, he gives them a prophetic statement. He said, you know what, you're not going to build it, but your son's going to build it. So he gives them a prophetic statement that says that his lineage is going to continue. His dynasty is going to continue, if we could say it that way. And so David is impressed that God has spoken about his family for years to come. And so David worshipped God, even though he's disappointed he can't. God gave him a hope that was superseded his desire to build the temple. But we see how much it was in the heart of David to build the temple, because he begins to prepare the things for the temple. He put away gold, he put away silver, he put away cedar, he put away stones, he put away jewels. He put all this stuff aside so that his son Solomon could build the temple, and he'd already have all. That shows you the heart of the man, that he wanted to do the things of God. No, you can't build it, David. But you didn't say I couldn't prepare for it, Lord, so I'm going to give everything I can. I may not be able to see this temple built in all its glory. I may not be able to see it. I can only picture it in my heart what it is. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to make sure my son has the best ingredients, the best materials that man can have to build that temple. So that when he's finished with it, God, it's going to be the beautiful building in the whole world. And it was. So we see that he even though he wasn't allowed to build it, one of the triumphs was he got to prepare for it. I may never see the fruition of all the works that are going to be started in the city of Edinburgh. But you know what? I am privileged that I'm laying the foundation for the work of God that's going on in the city of Edinburgh. I'm privileged, and I'm putting stuff aside, and I'm putting things to prepare and praying people to carry the gospel after I'm gone. And all these things, getting ready for what God is going to do in the city of Edinburgh. I may not see it, but it's in my heart to prepare, and that's what God looks at. That's one of his spiritual triumphs. And David's other spiritual triumph was the fact that he received a covenant from God that there would never not be a man from the house of David to sit on his throne. Jesus Christ was of the lineage of David. And he is the final king. So David's military triumph, we know that David conquered all the lands round about him, and he had a righteous rule. Now, you know, when we look at David, and we all think that, you know, David is a great king. He was a boy. And he's out with the sheep, and he's taking his harp out, and he's playing it, and he's singing the songs, and he's worshiping God and loving God as a young boy. And we know that God has to put that in his heart to do those things and everything else. But let's look at the other side of David. What about where he fell? The first one we know is the fact of Bathsheba. You see, David made a big mistake. Before he even messed up with Bathsheba, he made a big mistake. Because we read in the scripture how that David stayed home from the battle. You see, as king, he should have been out there with his army, leading them into battle to overcome the nation that he was fighting against. But he did not. He was at home, and he couldn't sleep. He was bored, if I can say it that way. What is it we usually say? An idle mind is the devil's playground, right? You get bored, and you'll start doing things wrong, believe you me. So you need to keep your mind and yourself active, doing something. But David's not, he's bored, and so he goes and he tries to sleep, and he can't even sleep, so he goes up on the rooftop to walk around the rooftop of his house, and he looks over into a neighboring house, and he sees a woman over there taking a bath. And because he's bored, things happen. He starts messing around, and he ends up bringing her to himself and having a relationship with her, even though she is a married woman. Because you see, the king has the right to do whatever he wants. He's the king. And we know how the story goes, and David goes, and Bathsheba finds out she's with child. She comes and tells David, and so David begins to devise a plan to have the wife, the husband of Bathsheba come home and go and have sexual relations with her, so he would think the child was his. And we know that Uriah comes home, but he will not go down to his house. He will not, because the children of Israel are intense. You see, Uriah has integrity. He would not allow himself the pleasures of this life when the children of Israel were in the midst of a battle Why should I go and enjoy my wife and my home and my family and my food and all that and my soft bed when my friends are sitting out on the hard ground sleeping, when my brethren are there fighting? He has integrity, Uriah does. And David even gets him drunk. He takes his plan to the next level. He gets him drunk in hopes that he'll stumble back to his house. But Uriah goes out. And again, integrity won't allow him to do it. And finally, David writes a letter and puts it in the hand of Uriah to carry to Joab into the battle. Uriah was carrying his own death sentence and didn't even know it. And so Uriah, we know, goes in and into the battle, and they put him in the hardest spot, and he's killed. And the information sent back to David. And David goes after a mourning period and takes Bathsheba for his own wife. When he does that, he opens up the door for trouble. And Nathan comes to him, and Nathan tells him this big old story about how a man comes and the guy takes his flock. Instead of taking of his multitudes, he takes from his neighbor that only has one and kills it and everything. And David gets mad because David was a just king. And he stood for the underdog because he was an underdog himself. He knew what it was like to run from the king who was mean to him and distrusted him. He knew what it was like to try and hide and save his life. And so when Nathan's telling this story, David's feelings are boiling up to the surface, and he's getting upset. And he said, whoever's done this is going to die. But then Nathan turns around and points his finger at David and says, you're the man. I can just imagine in his heart what David must have felt right then, because many a prophet, whoever ever did things to the king, and you can read them through the Word of God, they were all slain or done away with in some way, shape, or form. But here Nathan is bold enough to point his finger at David and says, you're the man. You're guilty of this. You took Uriah's only wife when you have a whole bunch of them out there in the house next door or whatever. And the house of women, you have all kinds of wives, and you got to go take this man's one wife. And he points his finger at him, and then he makes a proclamation. He said, the child that she's pregnant with right now, the child that was born, because it was already born, is going to die. And immediately the child fell sick. But we see David, he could have reacted like the other kings and got mad because he had the authority of the king. He could have reacted at Nathan and taken him and imprisoned him or done something nasty to him, but we don't see that. We see David must have been smote in his heart and everything, because immediately he leaves and he goes to the temple and he grabs a hold of the horns of the altar. What that means is he went to the temple and he fell on his face and began to repent before God. And we know that because of what happens and what's said afterward. He goes, and once the child dies, because that's what the prophet said, once the child dies, he gets up and he eats and he cleans himself up, and all his servants can't wonder why. Why didn't you do this while the child was alive? And he said, because, you know what? I did it because I knew God was merciful. And I was hoping that God would spare the child's life. But now that God has taken the child's life, there is nothing I can do. I can go to him, but he can't come to me. And so therefore God has chosen, and I have to bear this the rest of my life. It was because of my sin. It was because of my circumstance that child died.
Yeah, can I just take you a wee bit back? I thought because Bathsheba, Bathsheba, the king's wife, I thought she was managed to get David because she was more powerful, and David didn't fail to know or to realize his call from God, and that is how he ended up sleeping with the king's wife. Was it his did he start to, what am I going to explain now? Was it David who started to go to get the king's wife? Or was the king's wife who...
It wasn't the king's wife. Bathsheba was one of his army's wife. He was a captain in the army. Yeah. And he seen her on the rooftop. Because they used to take, the ladies would take their baths on the rooftop so nobody could see them. And so she was on the rooftop because at night that's what they would do in the privacy of the rooftop, is take their baths. And that way there, he seen her and he was enticed. And so he brought her to the palace. That's why I said when he should have been out fighting with the army, but he was at home and he was bored and everything else, and he gets, things started happening when he was, okay. So, let's go on. So we see how David's heart is really affected by it. And he goes and comforts Bathsheba, and they have a relationship, and of course we know Solomon is born. But because of David's transgressions, he has things happen to him in his own family. Absalom, Amnon. He was the firstborn of David. He rapes his sister, Tamar, which was Absalom's sister. We see that Absalom is so raised that he has Amnon killed. We see Absalom is banished from David for seeing David for 3 years, and he returns to Jerusalem and he still can't see David. But then we see that because of David's action, Absalom takes and tries to take over the throne of his father. And we know that Absalom is killed by Joab in the battle. Now, here we see some of the things that begin to reflect on David's life because of his circumstance. And you can sit down and look at your own life, and you can tell the times when you were disobedient to God, that God allowed things to come into your life to try and bring you back closer to Him. And in every situation that we see that David falls under or happens to him, we see that every time he turns around and goes to God with it. David learned his lesson the hard way. Hopefully we don't, but in our human nature we have a problem of doing these things anyways. We're all human. But sometimes we go and blame God when in actual fact it's our own fault. And I believe David's seen that and realized that. And that's why you have to have respect for David, even in his mistakes, and it cost him. His own children rose up against him. His own children did things that were unthinkable. And David had to bear that. And he had to live with that all of his life. And we see that finally that in the last deal is Absalom is killed by Joab in battle, when even David wants to spare Absalom. He loves his son. And yet, in it all, David stays faithful to God. Now, a couple of other things that happened. Adonijah promotes himself. You see, David is old, and he's stuck in bed. He can't get out. He's weak. And Adonijah, who is the oldest of the sons of David, promotes himself to be king because in all reality it is his right to be king because he was the oldest. But he leaves out the prophet, he leaves out the priest, and he leaves out Solomon. And of course Bathsheba and Nathan go before David and explain the situation to David. And David says, surely today Solomon will sit on my throne. And he makes it happen. And we know that Adonai, comes in, and what does he do? He grabs a hold of the horns of the altar, and he stays there and until Solomon's ready to forgive him. So David appoints Solomon as king, And he does this before he dies, but also we see something else that happens once Solomon is appointed as king. David calls Solomon into his bedside, and he begins to tell him, he says, don't let Joab go down to the grave in old age because of the things he did wrong. Don't let Simeon, who cursed me as I ran from Absalom, don't let him die of old age. And he begins to tell Solomon these three things, deal with these three men. And Solomon does it. He deals with each one of them, and we know that when we read on further through Scripture, how that Solomon actually has each one of them killed. Jonai, because he wants Abishag, which is the girl that was trying to keep David warm in bed, and because really what he was trying to do was gain the throne by subtlety, and so he has his brother killed, executed. We know that he executes Joab for the sins that he has brought upon his father's house and his house, and Joab's no longer in charge. He's executed. And we know Simeon is executed because he goes and leaves the city when he was told never to leave the city of Jerusalem, to stay there. And as soon as he left the city at any time, then he would die. And he comes back because he goes and chases a couple of his servants, and he ends up being killed. All right. So we see here there's the finish of 2 Samuel, that Solomon is now in charge. David had gone to meet his maker, and we've seen some of the life of David. But we notice the main thing, that David, in all of his mistakes, never once ran from God, but instead he ran to God. Every time he blundered, he ran to God. Every time he was in trouble, he ran to God. He did not try to do things on his own. He made sure that he put his trust in the Lord. When Ziklag was burned with fire, and his wife was gone, his wives were gone, and his sons and all his men, their wives and that were gone, they were ready to stone David. And here David goes and calls for the ephod, which represents the presence of God. And he calls for the ephod and seeks the face of God. Even in his times of trouble, David always sought God. Now, we're going to go in and talk a little bit about 1 Kings. We'll see if we can get through 1 Kings. If not, we'll do it. We will get through it next month. And then remember, in May will be your exam for this. How are you doing with your reading? You up to date? I know, but just read through, let me know where you're at, but try and have everything read through by the end of June. We want you to continue on, okay? Now,
I have so many exams in May.
yeah, well, I'm trying to do them in May so that it'll give you a reprieve, and we get them all marked for June, so everybody knows. I'm sure you'll go ahead. You're a smart young lady. So 1 Kings is, again, a continuation, and this is exactly what it is. We've gone from the end of the prophetic reign, and now we're stepping into the kingly reign. Samuel has died. Samuel was the last of the prophets of that day, and now we're going into where the kings are ruling over Israel. David being the first one, Saul was the first one, then David, and now Solomon, sorry. So, we're looking here, and we know that Solomon, when he is asked by God, what's your request? Solomon, makes a very profound request. He says, I just want to have wisdom to lead your people. because so they can come out and go out and come in and do it right. I want that kind of wisdom. And we know that that was Solomon's request, and God says, you know what, you didn't request lands, money, favor, or any of that stuff, and so I am going to give you all of that, plus your request to be the wisest of kings. And we know that Solomon's wisdom is profound, because the very first story that comes in is when he takes the baby that is, two women are crying, saying they're both, the child belongs to them, and he says, look, let's divide the child in half, give half to her and half to, but the child's mother, the one that the child really belonged to, cries out and says, no, no, let her have it, because she doesn't want to see it die. And and Solomon knows that this is actually the child's mother, because the other one says, no, let's divide it so neither one of us have any. And so it was very wise in what he did. But Solomon, in all of his wisdom, began to build the temple. And as he began to build the temple, he took the things that his father had left for him, and he began to prepare other things so that the temple could be built. And we know that the temple was built and finished by Solomon. But there's, and I'll find it here, Solomon, when he built the temple, he used everything. Gold was like nothing. Gold was on everything. Silver was like nothing. I mean, there was more gold used than silver. And all of the stuff that was built, they say, if you were to take and try and rebuild that temple today, it would be billions and billions and billions of pounds to try and rebuild it, because it was just so elaborate. It was done according to God's design, because David had the design and he turned it over to his son. But we see how things begin to happen in Solomon's life, where he began to trust in himself a little bit more than trusting God. And you can find that in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38, and 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished through all the parts. In other words, the house of God. And according to all the fashion of it, so it was finished. So was he 7 years in building it. And so we see Solomon spent 7 years building the house of the Lord. But Numbers, first verse of chapter 7, starts with a very controversial word. And it says, but. In other words, whenever somebody uses that word, but, and in other words, there's going to be a change here. There's going to be something different here. But Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. Solomon put, even though it was elaborate, Solomon put more into his own things than he did into the house of God. We see here where Solomon starts to lose out with his desire. David wanted to put more into the house of God and the things of God than he did his own house. But here Solomon's doing the other. If the temple was as beautiful as it was, and there's biblical scholars who described it, I've looked at pictures of what they